then down the hill further is the monastery of the Temptation. And but the Byzantines are up there, the modern one is down the hill. We will see that when we get to Jericho. I don't know why they put him so close to Jericho. I mean, we're not that far from Jericho, but I think he comes up into the wilderness a little ways. Maybe he's up this far, who knows. But this is our master in those 40 days.
So it just happens, the story begins down near Jericho, near the fords of Jericho, with the immersion of our master, his baptism, at which time the Spirit descends upon him. And then we read in the Gospel of Mark, immediately the Spirit impelled him. The verb is very strong. The Spirit drove him to go out into the wilderness. And he was in the wilderness 40 days being tempted by Satan. And he was with the wild beasts. And the angels were ministering to him. That's how it says it in the Gospel of Mark. Some interesting things to note here. 40 days in the wilderness. We'll learn in Matthew that he's 40 days in the wilderness without water, without food and water, which moves it into a miracle like that of Moses, who was 40 days on the mountain without food and water. You wouldn't make it one day out in this wilderness without water. So 40 days in the wilderness without water is a miracle. And then you'll remember he comes to the end of that period of 40 days, and it says that the angels ministered to him. We pick that up from Mark here. He was with the wild beasts, and the angels were ministering to him. In the Delitzsch Hebrew translation of the Gospels, wild beasts is simply hayot. That means wild beast, but it also is the name of a type of angel that we call living creatures. We translate as the living creatures. So reading it from the Delitzsch text, we would more likely read, he was with the hayot, and the angels were ministering to him. Flows very naturally, because in first century Judaism, you would mystics would undertake these long fasts, these 40-day fasts, in order to attain a spiritual revelation, in order to come into a vision, something like what Ezekiel experienced when he saw the Merkabah, the chariot of God, and the Hayot, the angels that carried for that chariot. So we have something similar going on here. Yeshua has received a revelation from heaven. He's heard a voice say, "You are my son." He's received the Spirit. The Spirit has driven him into the wilderness, and he's tempted by the Satan. We learn the temptations in the Gospel of Matthew. And it's interesting, you know, this narrative comes to us in a genre of temptation narratives. We find similar stories about Satan tempting Abraham and Isaac in order to dissuade them from carrying out the sacrifice on Mount Moriah. Very similar type of story where Satan appears to Abraham 3 times, tempts him 3 times to not take his son up to Mount Moriah as a sacrifice. It's in that same genre. And we have 3 temptations of the Master. The first one, turn these stones into bread. You know, he's hungry. He's out here in the wilderness, 40 days without food. Turn these stones into bread. You know, I always like to point out that that is not something that Satan has ever tempted me to do. I've never, even if I was starving to death, I wouldn't be tempted to turn this rock into bread. Because I'm never in that situation where I'm like, I know I shouldn't, but you know what I mean? I can't do that. I can't, so it's not tempting to me at all. Not at all. Or how about this one? He takes him by teleportation, by translation. He takes him to the holy city, to the temple, and stands him up on the pinnacle of the temple, looking down into the Kidron Valley, and says, here's what I'm going to tempt you to do. Throw yourself down from here, and the angels will carry you, and you won't strike your foot against a stone, as it says in the Psalms. It's not tempting. jumping off a height, plummeting to your death, not very tempting. Other things tempting to me, but I've never been tempted to throw myself from a high building. Like, you know, like I find it difficult to resist. Doesn't tempt me. Finally, the third temptation also doesn't sound very tempting. Bow down and worship the devil. I don't struggle with that in my life. You know, that's not something I struggle with. Like, oh, I just really want to worship Satan, but I know I'm trying not to. You know, so these are very strange temptations, don't you think? And they require a little bit more explanation. What kind of temptation is this? Well, these are temptations that would apply to the Messiah, because the Messiah is predicted to be the bread man, the one who will be, it says in Psalm 72, he will be like a cornfield. He will be like a field of grain to Israel. He will provide, it says that he will provide the manna. He will bring the manna back like it was in the days of Moses. He is sustenance for the people. So it would be tempting for Messiah to take that power and use that power that's been prophetically invested in him. Or the second temptation, to throw himself down. What's this temptation about? Well, it's this would be a very public spectacle. He throws himself down from the height of the temple and in front of everybody and floats down, levitates down to the ground. All of a sudden, everybody, there's going to be no more question. We could have settled this whole thing right now. This is the Messiah. This guy is the Messiah. It would have been, you know, we wouldn't have had this secrecy thing, like don't tell anyone. Instead, he could have just taken over right then and there. That would be tempting. That actually would be tempting. Just as an aside, I'd like to point out that his younger brother, James, actually did take the plunge from that spot and hit the ground and stood up. So he actually was born by angels. The fall did not kill him. It should have. It did not. Third temptation. What's the third temptation? To worship the devil. How is it possible that this is tempting to our master? That he would find this tempting, like he would want to worship the devil? Well, the answer is that it says the devil took him to a very high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory, and said, all these I will give you. That's what Messiah is supposed to be. The ruler of the world. The king over a universal kingdom. So if he had done this, if he had taken this opportunity, our master knows that he could have gotten around the cross. But not only that, I mean, think about it. He could have gotten around the Roman siege of Jerusalem. He could have gotten around the massacre of the Jewish people in the Jewish revolt. He could have avoided the second Jewish revolt and the massacre that took place there. He could have avoided all the persecutions that were to befall his community, his disciples, and his church. He could have avoided 2,000 years of ugly history, of exile, of darkness. He could have avoided everything you saw in Yad Vashem yesterday if he had taken this route, this shortcut to the kingdom. It would be very tempting to take a shortcut to the kingdom. Instead, he answers each of these temptations with a word of Torah. He contradicts each temptation with a quotation from the book of Deuteronomy, a book which comes to us from the plain of the Jordan, where he was just immersed prior to this confrontation with the devil. I like to place this story during the 40 days leading up to Yom Kippur, just because it fits there liturgically. 40 days before the fast of the Day of Atonement, we begin a period, a season of struggle with the devil that is called Shuvah, the days of repentance, the days of return. And over these 40 days of preparation for the high holy day of Yom Kippur, we're ready to face off with the devil